The Blair Witch Project no doubt goes down as one of the scariest horror films of all time thanks to the top-notch execution and brilliant found-footage techniques crafted by co-writer-directors Daniel Myrick and Eduardo Sanchez. Not once did the duo actually show us the film's primary antagonist, the Blair Witch, hiding her with the use of implied violence and ingenious off-screen threats, just like how Jaws lurked beneath the water, imposing a hidden, deadly threat upon that film's characters. The Blair Witch cackled, unseen in the dark of the woods, terrifying its soon-to-be victims to their very cores. Since we never actually see the Blair Witch in the film, not even in the final sequence where Heather Donahue and Mike Williams are implied to be murdered, and rather than taking for granted that the Blair Witch was the murderer, we thought we should examine who actually did the killing. Upon digging further into the details presented within the film, the facts not only point away from the Blair Witch as the killer, they actually zero in on the filmmakers themselves, the ones who went missing back in 1994. There are a handful of theories as to who could have murdered these three individuals, with culprits ranging from the obvious Blair Witch herself to the documentary's cameraman Josh Leonard as the primary suspect. There are even a few details that point to Josh working with the documentary's sound guy Mike, potentially under the control of the Blair Witch to lure in their mutual friend Heather. Did the Blair Witch do it? Did Josh do it? Did Josh and Mike do it together? That's what we're going to discuss, but in order to do that, we need to look at the mythology and consider what's happening at the end of the movie. This column will strictly be an examination of the events within the running time of the Blair Witch Project film itself, not including the events of the sequel. There is expanded upon information, along with character bias, now listed on the Blair Witch website and wiki pages, which I will not go into here. In the final scene, Mike and Heather wake up to Josh's screams in the middle of the night and run blindly into the woods toward his voice with nothing to direct them but the lights on their cameras. The duo soon stumbles upon an abandoned building in the woods. The rundown structure is presumably building referenced earlier during the interview portion of the film as the cabin that the two hunters camped nearby, only to never be seen or heard from again. Mike immediately enters the house and bravely races upstairs using only his camera light and Josh's screaming voice as a guide. Heather, frightened beyond belief, does her best to keep up with him, chasing behind with her own camera. As the two rush up the stairs, children's handprints can be seen cluttering the dank, decrepit walls. These are a likely indicator we are inside the home where Rustin Parr murdered the 7 innocent children some years ago. Upon reaching the upper level of the house, Josh's voice now appears to be coming from the basement. Mike, reaching an almost panic state, blasts down into the cellar hoping to find Josh. But when we see his camera hit the ground, we know this is not the case. A screaming Heather reaches the cellar, likely the dreaded scene of the original Parr children murders, to find Mike facing the corner of the room. She deliriously screams until her camera also hits the floor, as she is presumably killed. But what does this mean? While many believe the Blair Witch to be the obvious killer, there is one very important detail that points to Josh as being the one who actually committed the murders. The story of the 7 Burkittsville children murdered by Rustin Parr. In other words, the children in a tea killed by the Blair Witch. This is important because in the final scene, Mike faces the corner, which tells us his implied death is absolutely related to the Parr murders of the 7 children. So, it's likely that Parr was influenced by the Blair Witch to commit the murders of the children, an idea that has since been written into his wiki page, which means that the Blair Witch does not, in fact, actually commit the murders herself, possesses and or influences others to do so. That said, many fans have come to believe that Josh is the likely suspect as the one who murdered Mike and Heather. The fact that his belongings were targeted when their campsite was destroyed would also suggest that the Blair Witch was targeting him even earlier on their trip. But how do we explain why Mike would agree to face the corner? In the story of Parr, the children were forced to face the corner because Rustin didn't want them to watch as he killed the other child. The fact that Mike doesn't even appear to be scared, but rather dazed or controlled by an unseen presence, further validates this notion that Mike was responding to a possessed Josh. So, in the end, Josh is the most likely candidate to have actually pulled off the killings at the end of the film.
Please subscribe and join me next week as I look into Blair Witch.